They said she was nothing. A servant. A shadow in the corners of the palace. But when the Alpha King dropped to his knees before her in front of the entire court, everything they thought they knew shattered. Whether you're watching from the Eastern or Western Hemisphere or anywhere else in this beautiful world, this story will reach into your chest and remind you that your worth was never determined by how others see you. It was written in your blood all along. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because stories like this, stories about hidden power, forbidden love, and destiny that refuses to be denied, these are the stories that change how we see ourselves. And tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? I want to send you a hug, no matter where you are in this world. We're all connected by stories like these. Now, let me take you to the Northern Territories, where snow falls like secrets and wolves run beneath a moonlit sky. Her name was GRETA Schneider, and for 3 years, she had scrubbed the marble floors of the Eisenkrone Palace until her hands bled. 3 years of bowing her head. 3 years of whispered insults that followed her like shadows through the corridors. 3 years of pretending she was invisible while the noble wolves of the court stepped over her as if she were nothing more than the water in her bucket. But GRETA had a secret. Every night, when the palace fell silent and the moon climbed high above the frost-covered peaks of the Schwarzwald Mountains, something inside her stirred. Something wild. Something that terrified her more than the cruelty of Lady Christina von Heller, the Alpha King's intended bride. More than the hunger that gnawed at her stomach. More than the cold that seeped through the thin walls of the servants' quarters. It was a presence. Ancient. Powerful. Sleeping just beneath her skin, waiting. And tonight it was waking up. GRETA pressed her forehead against the cold stone wall of the kitchen, her breath coming in short gasps. The other servants had gone to bed hours ago, but she couldn't sleep. Not when the full moon hung so heavy in the sky that it felt like it might crash through the palace windows. "Not again," she whispered, squeezing her eyes shut. "Please, not again." Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the wash basin. The water inside rippled, though she hadn't touched it. Then her reflection began to change. Her ordinary brown eyes flickered gold. Just for a second. Just long enough to remind her that she was living a lie. "You're stronger than this," she told herself, the words her mother had whispered to her before. Before everything fell apart. Before the attack that killed her parents. Before she fled to the Eisenkrone Palace with nothing but the clothes on her back and a desperate need to disappear. Because GRETA Schneider wasn't just a servant. She was the last surviving heir of the Mondstein bloodline, the ancient line of lunar wolves that had ruled the Northern Territories for 1,000 years before the Eisenkrone pack rose to power through blood and betrayal. And if anyone discovered who she really was, they would kill her before dawn. The Alpha King's name was WOLFGANG EISENKRONE, and he was everything the legends promised and everything GRETA had learned to fear. 6 feet 4 inches of raw power and controlled fury. Eyes the color of winter storms. A jawline that looked carved from the same granite as the mountains surrounding his territory. When he walked through the palace, even the bravest warriors lowered their gazes. Not out of fear alone, but out of respect for a king who had fought for every inch of his crown. GRETA had seen him exactly 47 times in 3 years. She'd counted. Each time, she'd made herself smaller, invisible, just another servant in a palace full of shadows. But she'd watched him, studied him, learned the patterns of his movements, the weight of his silences, the rare moments when something that might have been loneliness flickered across his face before his mask of control slammed back into place. He was engaged to Lady Christina von Heller, the daughter of the wealthiest pack in the Southern Territories. Their union would strengthen the kingdom, forge alliances, and secure the Eisenkrone legacy for generations. It was a political arrangement. Everyone knew it, including Wolfgang, including Christina, who wore her future crown like a weapon and treated the palace servants like dirt beneath her perfectly polished boots. Especially GRETA. "You there, servant girl." GRETA's heart sank as she recognized that voice. She'd been carrying fresh linens through the East Corridor, trying to remain unnoticed, but apparently, the universe had other plans. She turned slowly, keeping her eyes downcast. Yes, my lady. Christina von Heller stood at the top of the grand staircase, resplendent in a gown of deep crimson that probably cost more than Greta would earn in 10 lifetimes. Her blonde hair was perfectly arranged, her makeup flawless, her smile as sharp as broken glass. 2 of her ladies-in-waiting flanked her, giggling behind their hands. Did you polish my mirrors this morning? Christina descended the stairs with predatory grace, each step deliberate. I asked for them to be spotless. Instead, I could barely see my reflection. Greta had spent 2 hours on those mirrors. They'd been perfect. I apologize, my lady. I'll attend to them again immediately. You'll attend to them now. Christina stopped directly in front of Greta, so close that Greta could smell her expensive perfume. And this time, perhaps you'll actually do your job correctly. Or are you too stupid even for that? The ladies-in-waiting laughed. Something flickered in Greta's chest. That presence stirring again. Her wolf pressing against the cage she'd built around it. Not now, she begged silently. Please, not now. I understand, my lady. Greta kept her voice steady, emotionless. It won't happen again. See that it doesn't. Christina reached out and deliberately knocked the linens from Greta's arms. They scattered across the marble floor. Oh, how clumsy of me. You'd better pick those up before someone trips. More laughter. Greta dropped to her knees, gathering the linens with mechanical precision. She'd learned long ago that the fastest way through humiliation was to feel nothing, to become nothing. She didn't see Christina's foot move until it was too late. The kick wasn't hard enough to injure, but it was calculated, designed to send Greta sprawling across the floor, to maximize embarrassment, to remind her of her place. Greta hit the marble hard, the impact knocking the breath from her lungs. And then she heard it. That's enough. The voice was quiet, controlled, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. The laughter stopped instantly. Greta looked up, still sprawled on the floor, and found herself staring at Wolfgang Eisenkrone. The Alpha King stood at the end of the corridor, and the temperature in the hallway seemed to drop 10 degrees. His storm-gray eyes were fixed on Christina, and the expression on his face could have frozen fire. Wolfgang. Christina's voice brightened instantly, all traces of cruelty vanishing behind a practiced smile. I didn't realize you were. I said that's enough. Wolfgang moved forward with the fluid grace of a predator. Apologized to her. Silence crashed through the corridor like a physical thing. Christina's smile faltered. What? You heard me. Apologize. Now. Greta's heart hammered against her ribs. This couldn't be happening. Alpha Kings didn't defend servants, especially not against their own intended brides. Wolfgang, surely you're not serious. She's just a member of my household. Wolfgang's voice dropped lower, more dangerous. Someone under my protection. And you will treat her with respect, or you will leave my palace. The choice is yours. Christina's face went through several shades of red and white. Her ladies-in-waiting had gone completely silent, staring at their feet. The power dynamics in the room had shifted so dramatically that Greta could almost taste it in the air. Finally, through gritted teeth, Christina said, My apologies. She didn't look at Greta, didn't mean a word of it. But she'd said it. Help her up, Wolfgang commanded. For a moment, Greta thought Christina might actually refuse and damn the consequences. But self-preservation won out. Christina extended one hand, her expression murderous, and Greta had no choice but to take it. The moment their hands touched, something impossible happened. A shock of pure energy jolted through Greta's entire body. Her wolf surged forward, stronger than it had ever been, and she felt it, the unmistakable pull of recognition. The bond that legend spoke of but she'd never believed existed. No. This wasn't possible. Greta stumbled as Christina immediately released her hand, and she might have fallen again if Wolfgang hadn't moved with impossible speed to steady her. His hand closed around her upper arm, strong and warm, And the moment he touched her, that shock of recognition exploded into something catastrophic. Their eyes met, and Wolfgang's pupils dilated, his entire body going rigid with shock. His nostrils flared as he caught her scent, and GRETA watched the realization slam into him like a physical blow. He felt it too. The mate bond. Undeniable. Absolute. Between an alpha king and a servant girl. Between enemies, though he didn't know it yet. Wolfgang released her as if she'd burned him, taking a step back. His expression was carefully controlled, but GRETA could see the storm raging behind his eyes. The confusion. The impossibility of what had just happened. "Are you hurt?" His voice came out rougher than before. "No, Your Majesty." GRETA forced herself to drop into a curtsy, breaking eye contact, desperately trying to get herself under control. "Thank you for your kindness." She needed to leave. Before she did something catastrophic like shift in the middle of the palace corridor or throw herself at a man who was engaged to another woman. A man who would probably kill her if he knew her real name. "What's your name?" Wolfgang asked. GRETA's heart stopped. "GRETA, Your Majesty." It wasn't a lie. GRETA was her real name. She'd only hidden her surname, Mondstein. The name that would sign her death warrant. "GRETA," Wolfgang repeated, as if testing the weight of it on his tongue. As if memorizing it. "You may go." It wasn't a request. It was a command wrapped in confusion, and GRETA didn't waste a second. She gathered the scattered linens, curtsied again, and fled down the corridor as fast as dignity would allow. Behind her she heard Christina's voice, sharp with suspicion. "Wolfgang, what was that about? You've never even noticed the servants before." And Wolfgang's response, carefully neutral. "Everyone in this palace deserves basic respect. I would have thought that was obvious." GRETA didn't hear the rest. She was already gone, disappearing into the servants' passages, her heart racing and her wolf howling inside her chest. Everything had just changed, and she had absolutely no idea what to do about it. GRETA didn't sleep that night. She lay in her narrow bed in the servants' quarters, listening to the soft breathing of the other maids around her, and tried to understand how the universe could be so spectacularly cruel. Mate bond. With the Alpha King. With the man whose family had destroyed hers. The Eisenkrone pack had risen to power 30 years ago during what the history books called the Northern Rebellion. They said the Mondstein bloodline had become corrupt, that they'd abused their power, that the revolution was necessary and just. But GRETA's mother had told her a different story. She'd whispered it late at night when GRETA was small, her voice heavy with grief and rage. The Eisenkrones hadn't fought for justice, they'd fought for power. They'd orchestrated attacks, blamed them on the Mondstein pack, and used the resulting chaos to seize control. Hundreds had died. Entire families had been slaughtered, including GRETA's. She'd been 15 when the final attack came. Her father, Alpha of the Mondstein pack, had been murdered in his own home. Her mother had died protecting GRETA, buying her daughter enough time to escape through secret passages while their house burned. "Run," her mother had gasped, blood soaking through her dress. "Hide. Change your name. Never tell anyone who you are. Promise me, GRETA. Promise me." GRETA had promised. And she'd kept that promise for 3 years, surviving on the streets before finally taking a position as a servant in the very palace her family had once visited as honored guests. She'd told herself it was strategic, that she was gathering information, waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth about the Eisenkrone pack's treachery. That someday she would clear her family's name and reclaim what was rightfully hers. But now, with the mate bond humming through her veins like electricity, everything was infinitely more complicated. Because the mate bond wasn't something you could ignore or deny. It was carved into wolf genetics, an imperative older than civilization itself. The bond meant Wolfgang was her perfect match, the other half of her soul, the one person in the entire world designed to complement her strengths and weaknesses. And she was his. Which meant the universe either had a twisted sense of humor, or there was something about this situation she didn't yet understand. GRETA pressed her hands over her face, fighting back the frustration that threatened to overwhelm her. "Can't sleep." The voice made Greta's eyes snap open. Margaret Schmidt, another servant and the closest thing Greta had to a friend in this place, was watching her from the next bed over. She was older than Greta by about 10 years, with kind eyes and hands roughened by decades of hard work. "Just thinking," Greta whispered, "about what happened today." Margaret propped herself up on one elbow. "Everyone's talking about it. The Alpha King defending a servant against Lady Christina. That's never happened before." "He was just being fair," Greta said quickly. Too quickly. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. "Fair. Right." She was quiet for a moment, then added, "Be careful, Greta. That kind of attention from the king. It's dangerous. Especially with the wedding only 3 months away." 3 months. Greta's stomach twisted. In 3 months, Wolfgang would marry Christina, and the mate bond would become a source of constant, agonizing pain for both of them. Rejecting a mate bond was possible, but it required a formal ritual and it left scars that never fully healed. "I'll be careful," Greta promised. But even as she said it, she knew it was already too late. Wolfgang Eisenkrone stood at the window of his private chambers and watched the moon set over the Schwarzwald Mountains. He hadn't slept either. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face. Those dark eyes that had flickered with something wild when he'd touched her. The way she'd felt when his hand closed around her arm, like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. His wolf had recognized her instantly, howling with joy and possessiveness and absolute certainty. Wolfgang had nearly shifted right there in the corridor, his control shredding like paper in the face of something primal and undeniable. His mate was a servant girl named Greta, and he was engaged to Christina von Heller. "This is impossible," Wolfgang muttered, pressing his forehead against the cold glass. "What's impossible, my friend?" Wolfgang didn't turn around. He recognized the voice of his beta and closest advisor, Klaus Hoffmann. They'd known each other since childhood, fought side by side in countless battles, and Klaus was one of the few people in the world who could enter Wolfgang's chambers without being announced. "Everything," Wolfgang said flatly. Klaus moved to stand beside him at the window. He was shorter than Wolfgang but broader, built like a bear, with scarred hands and eyes that missed nothing. "Does this have anything to do with why you nearly tore Christina's head off in front of half the court today? She was abusing a servant. You've never cared about that before." Klaus's voice was gentle but relentless. "What changed?" Wolfgang was silent for a long moment. Then, because Klaus would figure it out eventually anyway, he said, "I found my mate." Klaus went very still. "What?" "The servant girl. Greta." Wolfgang's hands clenched into fists. "The moment I touched her, the bond. It was instant. Absolute. And from the look on her face, she felt it too." "Gods above," Klaus breathed. "Wolfgang, you can't." "I know." Wolfgang's voice was harsh. "I know what I can't do. I have responsibilities. Alliances. The von Heller family controls the southern trade routes. If I break this engagement, it could destabilize the entire kingdom. We could be looking at war." "But she's your mate," Klaus said quietly. "That's not something you can just ignore. Watch me." Wolfgang turned away from the window, his expression hardening into the mask he showed the world. "I've spent my entire life doing my duty, putting the kingdom first. This doesn't change that." Klaus studied him for a long moment. "You know what happens when you reject a mate bond? Pain. Emptiness. Some wolves don't survive it. Then I'll be stronger than they were." Wolfgang moved to his desk, shuffling through documents as if this conversation wasn't tearing him apart inside. Arrange for the servant girl, Greta, to be reassigned, somewhere far from the main palace. I don't want to see her again. Wolfgang. That's an order, Klaus. Klaus's jaw tightened, but he nodded. As you command, Your Majesty. He left, and Wolfgang was alone again with the moon and his wolf, which was howling in rage at the decision he'd just made. But Wolfgang had learned long ago that being a king meant sacrifice, even if this particular sacrifice might destroy him. 3 days later, GRETA received her new assignment. "You're being transferred to the North Tower," the head housekeeper, Frau Müller, announced without preamble. She was a stern woman with iron-gray hair and no patience for questions. "You'll be responsible for maintaining the Alpha King's private library. You'll work alone, start before dawn, and finish before His Majesty begins his daily schedule. You are not to interact with him. Is that clear?" Greta's heart sank. The North Tower was the most isolated part of the palace, accessible only through a series of winding staircases that would leave her completely cut off from the other servants. It was clearly a punishment, a way to keep her away from the king without actually dismissing her from service. Wolfgang was trying to put distance between them. Made sense. It was logical. It was probably the smartest decision for everyone involved. So why did it feel like her chest was being crushed? "Yes, Frau Müller," Greta said quietly. "I understand." "Good. You start tomorrow at dawn." The North Tower Library was magnificent. Greta stood in the doorway, momentarily forgetting her misery as she took in the sight. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined with thousands of books, their leather spines gleaming in the early morning light. Ancient texts in languages she didn't recognize. Maps of territories that might not exist anymore. A massive desk near the window, covered in papers and documents. This was Wolfgang's private space, where he came to think, to plan, to escape the weight of the crown. And now it was hers to maintain. Greta moved through the library slowly, trailing her fingers along the spines of books, breathing in the smell of old paper and leather and something distinctly masculine that made her wolf purr with recognition. This was a mistake. Being surrounded by his scent, his belongings, his essence, it would only make the mate bond stronger, more impossible to ignore. But orders were orders. Greta started with dusting, losing herself in the familiar rhythm of work. She was careful with the papers on Wolfgang's desk, not reading them but straightening them into neat piles. She noticed maps with military markings, letters with official seals, reports about border disputes and trade negotiations. The weight of a kingdom, laid out in ink and paper. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear the footsteps on the stairs until it was too late. "What are you doing here?" Greta spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Wolfgang stood in the doorway, dressed for training in simple dark clothing that somehow made him look even more dangerous than his formal attire. His hair was slightly disheveled, and there was a fresh cut above one eyebrow, already healing with supernatural speed. He clearly hadn't expected to find her here. "I was assigned to the library, Your Majesty." Greta dropped into a curtsy, keeping her eyes down. "Frau Müller said I was to maintain it. I'm sorry. I didn't realize you'd be here so early. I'll leave immediately." "No." The word came out sharper than Wolfgang seemed to intend. He cleared his throat. "No, you can continue. I just need to retrieve something." He moved past her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the scent of pine and snow and something wild that made her wolf howl with longing. The mate bond pulled between them like a physical thread, growing stronger with proximity. Wolfgang grabbed a document from his desk, but instead of leaving immediately, he paused. Greta could feel his eyes on her, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "How long have you worked in the palace?" he asked abruptly. This was dangerous. Conversation meant connection, and connection would only make everything harder. But she couldn't exactly refuse to answer her king. 3 years, Your Majesty. And before that, Greta's mind raced. "I was alone. My family died when I was young. I came here seeking employment." It was true in the broadest possible sense. Wolfgang was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry for your loss." The sincerity in his voice nearly undid her. Greta risked a glance up and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Something that looked almost like longing before his mask of control slammed back into place. "Thank you, Your Majesty," she whispered. You should call me Wolfgang. Greta's eyes widened. I couldn't possibly. When we're alone, Wolfgang amended quickly. Here in this space. The formality feels. He trailed off, seeming to struggle with words. Wrong. 'Cause they were mates. Because some ancient part of him recognized that she was supposed to be his equal, not his servant. I should go, Wolfgang said suddenly, turning away. Continue your work. He was halfway to the door when Greta's voice stopped him. Wolfgang. His name on her lips. She'd never said it before, and the sound seemed to freeze him in place. Yes. Did you ask for me to be transferred here? Silence stretched between them, heavy with everything they couldn't say. Yes, Wolfgang finally admitted. I thought distance would help. Does it? Greta asked quietly. Wolfgang looked back at her, and for just a moment, his carefully controlled mask slipped. She saw the rawness underneath, the conflict, the desire, the agony of denying what every cell in his body was screaming for. No, he said. It doesn't help at all. Then he was gone, and Greta was alone with her racing heart and the overwhelming certainty that they were both doomed. Over the following weeks, a dangerous pattern emerged. Greta would arrive at dawn to clean the library. Most days, Wolfgang wasn't there, and she could work in peace, surrounded by his scent but spared his presence. But some mornings he was waiting. They never touched, never acknowledged the mate bond directly. But they talked. Wolfgang would ask her about books she'd read, and Greta, who had received an education befitting her status as a Mondstein heir, would forget to hide her intelligence. They debated philosophy, discussed history, argued about military strategy until Wolfgang looked at her with undisguised surprise. You're not a simple servant, he said one morning. His eyes sharp with suspicion and something else. Fascination, perhaps. Greta's heart raced. I like to read, Your Majesty. The castle has an extensive library for household staff. It was a weak excuse, but Wolfgang let it pass. On other days, they simply existed in comfortable silence. Wolfgang would work at his desk while Greta moved through the library, and the mate bond would hum between them like a song only they could hear. It was torture. Beautiful, agonizing torture. And then, 6 weeks after she'd started working in the North Tower, everything changed. Greta was reshelf a particularly heavy tome when her hand slipped. The book tumbled to the floor, landing open to reveal pages she'd never seen before. Hidden pages. Her breath caught as she knelt down, examining the book more closely. Someone had carefully cut out the center of the pages, creating a hollow space. And inside that space was a letter, yellowed with age but still legible. Greta's hands trembled as she began to read. It was a letter from Heinrich Mondstein, her grandfather, to someone named Frederick. The date was 30 years ago, just months before the Northern Rebellion. Frederick, my old friend, I fear we are running out of time. The reports of corruption within my pack are false, manufactured by those who seek to take our power for themselves. I have evidence, documents, witnesses, that prove the Eisenkrone pack has been orchestrating attacks against their own people and blaming us. They want war. They want a reason to destroy us and take control of the northern territories. I'm sending you copies of everything I've discovered. If something happens to me, if they succeed in their plot, please promise me you'll protect my family. Promise me the truth won't die with me. The Eisenkrones are not what they seem. And if they succeed, may the gods have mercy on us all. Greta's vision blurred with tears. Her grandfather had known. He'd had evidence. And someone named Frederick had been supposed to protect her family but clearly failed. What are you reading? Greta's head snapped up. Wolfgang stood in the doorway, and the expression on his face was ice-cold rage. She'd been so absorbed in the letter that she hadn't heard him approach. And now she was caught, holding evidence that his family had built their kingdom on lies and murder. Hi! Greta scrambled to her feet, the letter still clutched in her hand. I didn't mean to. Give it to me. Wolfgang's voice was deadly quiet. Wolfgang, please let me explain. Now. The alpha command slammed into her like a physical force. Greta's body moved before her mind could catch up, her hand extending to offer him the letter. Wolfgang snatched it from her, his eyes scanning the words. She watched the color drain from his face, watched something that might have been horror flicker across his expression before fury replaced it. "Where did you get this?" he demanded. "It was hidden in the book. I found it by accident." "Liar." Wolfgang's eyes blazed gold. "You're a spy. You've been planted here to undermine my family, to spread propaganda about the rebellion." "It's not propaganda." The words burst out of Greta before she could stop them. "Your family murdered mine. They orchestrated the entire rebellion. My grandfather had evidence, and they killed him for it." Silence crashed through the library. Wolfgang went very, very still. "Your grandfather." Greta realized her mistake a heartbeat too late. "You're a Mondstein," Wolfgang breathed, and the betrayal in his voice cut deeper than any blade. "That's why you're here. That's why you've been pretending to be. Gods above, I've been such a fool." "Wolfgang, please. Don't." He held up a hand, and Greta fell silent. "Don't say anything else. Don't lie to me again." "I never lied about what matters," Greta said desperately. "I never lied about being my mate." Wolfgang's laugh was bitter. "Because that's what this is really about, isn't it? You felt the bond. You knew you could manipulate me. Use our connection to destroy everything my family built. No, that's not enough." The windows rattled with the force of his rage. Wolfgang's eyes were fully gold now, his wolf barely contained beneath his skin. "You will leave this palace," he said, each word carefully controlled. "Tonight. If I ever see you again, I will have you executed for espionage and treason. Do you understand?" Greta felt like she was dying. The mate bond twisted in her chest, howling in agony at the rejection. "Wolfgang, if you'd just listen. Get out." Ran. Greta fled down the tower stairs, tears streaming down her face, the mate bond tearing at her insides like claws. Behind her, she heard the sound of destruction, Wolfgang destroying his library in a rage that mirrored the storm inside her own heart. This was it. This was how their story ended. Not with love, but with betrayal and blood and 30 years of lies finally catching up to them both. But Greta Schneider was not the kind of woman who ran forever. She'd spent 3 years hiding, 3 years surviving, 3 years pretending to be less than she was. No more. Greta made it as far as the palace gates before she stopped, her mother's dying words echoing in her ears. "Promise me the truth won't die with me." The truth. Her grandfather had fought for the truth. Her parents had died protecting it. And now she had evidence, actual tangible evidence, that the Eisenkrone Pack's rise to power had been built on murder and lies. If she ran now, that truth would be buried forever. But more than that, Wolfgang deserved to know. Mate bond or no mate bond, he was living a lie. His entire reign was built on his father's treachery, and he had no idea. She'd seen the horror in his eyes when he read that letter. Part of him had already suspected the truth, even if he couldn't admit it yet. Greta turned around and walked back into the palace. She found him in the library, exactly where she'd left him. The room was destroyed. Books scattered across the floor, shelves overturned, papers everywhere. And in the center of it all, Wolfgang sat with his head in his hands, the letter clutched in one fist. He looked up when she entered, and the expression on his face nearly broke her heart. He looked devastated. "I told you to leave," he said hoarsely. "I know." Greta stepped over the debris, moving slowly, carefully. "But I can't. Not until you hear the whole truth. I don't want to hear any more lies." "Then hear the truth." Greta knelt in front of him, close enough to touch but not quite daring to. "My name is Greta Mondstein. My grandfather was Henrik Mondstein, Alpha of the Northern Territories. 30 years ago your father, with the help of several other pack leaders, orchestrated a series of attacks against both your own pack and neutral territories. They blamed those attacks on my grandfather, turned the other packs against him, and used the resulting chaos to launch the rebellion. Wolfgang's jaw clenched. My father was a hero. He saved the kingdom from a tyrant. Your father was ambitious, GRETA said gently. And perhaps he convinced himself that the ends justified the means. Perhaps he even believed the lies he told. But Wolfgang, my grandfather, was not the monster your history books describe. He was a good man who was trying to protect his people from a conspiracy he couldn't prove. And you have proof now. One letter from a dead man. I have more than that. GRETA reached into her dress and pulled out a small, worn journal she'd been carrying since her mother's death. This was my mother's. She documented everything: names, dates, places. Every piece of evidence my grandfather gathered before he was murdered. I've been too afraid to show it to anyone, too afraid of what would happen if the truth came out. But I can't keep hiding anymore. She held the journal out to Wolfgang. He stared at it as if it were a poisonous snake. If what you're saying is true, if my father built our kingdom on murder and lies, then everything I've fought for, everything I've tried to be, it's all meaningless. No. GRETA moved closer, daring to touch his hand. The mate bond flared between them, warm and alive despite the pain. You are not your father. You didn't know about this. You've tried to rule with honor and justice. That matters. Does it? Wolfgang looked at her, and his eyes were hollow. How many people have suffered because of my family's lies? How many innocents died? I don't know, GRETA admitted. But I know that you can make it right. You can be the king who finally tells the truth, who honors the memory of those who died, who builds a kingdom on justice instead of lies. Wolfgang took the journal with trembling hands. He opened it slowly, and GRETA watched as he read page after page of carefully documented evidence. Dates and times of attacks. Names of witnesses who had later disappeared. Financial records showing payments from Wolfgang's father to mercenaries. Letters between conspirators. It was all there. Undeniable. Fleming. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and still Wolfgang read. GRETA sat beside him in silence, waiting, her heart breaking for him as she watched his entire world crumble and rebuild itself in real time. Finally, as the afternoon light began to fade, Wolfgang closed the journal. His face was streaked with tears he hadn't bothered to hide. My gods, he whispered. What has my family done? What they thought they had to, GRETA said softly. What they convinced themselves was right. But Wolfgang, you're not them. You can choose differently. Can I? He looked at her, and the vulnerability in his eyes took her breath away. I'm about to marry Christina von Heller. Her family supported my father during the rebellion. If this evidence comes out, if the truth is revealed, they'll withdraw their support. We could be looking at civil war. Or, GRETA said carefully, you could tell the truth and give people a chance to choose unity over revenge. You could acknowledge what happened, make reparations to the families who were wronged, and build a kingdom based on honesty instead of fear. Wolfgang laughed bitterly. You make it sound so simple. It's not simple. It's the hardest thing you'll ever do. GRETA took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. But it's right. And I think deep down you've always known something was wrong. Haven't you? Wolfgang was quiet for a long time. Then he nodded slowly. There were inconsistencies. Things that didn't quite add up in the official histories. Questions my father refused to answer. I told myself it didn't matter, that the past was the past, but... He squeezed her hand. You're right. I've always known. So what will you do? Wolfgang looked at their joined hands, at the mate bond that hummed between them like a promise. First, I'm going to break my engagement to Christina. GRETA's heart leapt. Wolfgang. She's not my mate. You are. Wolfgang lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that sent electricity racing through her entire body. And I've spent enough of my life lying and pretending. I won't marry someone I don't love just for political convenience. Not when my true mate is right here. The kingdom will survive. Wolfgang's voice was firm now, determined. Klaus has been telling me for years that I need to trust my people more, that they're stronger than I give them credit for. Maybe it's time I listen to him. And the truth about the rebellion will come out. All of it. Wolfgang stood, pulling Greta to her feet with him. I'll call a gathering of all the pack leaders. I'll present the evidence. I'll acknowledge my family's crimes and offer reparations to the survivors. And then I'll let them decide whether I deserve to continue as their king. Wolfgang, they could kill me, exile me. Yes. Wolfgang cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. But at least I'll die with honor. At least I'll die knowing I did the right thing. You're not going to die, Greta said fiercely. I won't let you. Wolfgang smiled, and it was the first real smile she'd seen from him. Is that so, little wolf? That's so. Greta rose up on her toes, bringing her face close to his. You're my mate, Wolfgang Eisenkrone, which means where you go, I go. And together, we're going to rebuild this kingdom into something worthy of both our families' legacies. Together, Wolfgang echoed, and then he was kissing her. The mate bond exploded between them like fireworks. Every cell in Greta's body sang with recognition and joy and fierce, overwhelming love. Wolfgang's arms wrapped around her, pulling her close, and she could feel his wolf rising to meet hers. Two halves of a whole, finally united. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Wolfgang rested his forehead against hers. I love you, GRETA MONDSTEIN. I think I've loved you from the moment I saw you on that corridor floor, refusing to break even when the world was crushing you. I love you too, Greta whispered. Even though loving you is complicated and dangerous and probably insane. The best things usually are. Breaking an engagement to the daughter of the most powerful family in the Southern Territories did not go well. Christina von Heller threw what could only be described as a legendary tantrum when Wolfgang called off the wedding. She screamed, she threatened, she threw priceless vases at Wolfgang's head. Her father, Lord Heinrich von Heller, was worse, cold and calculating and promising retribution. You will regret this, Eisenkrone, he said, his voice dripping with venom. My family has supported yours for 30 years. Without us, you are nothing. Then I will learn to be nothing, Wolfgang replied calmly. But I will not marry a woman I do not love when my true mate stands before me. That's when he'd announced it, in front of half the court, with Greta standing beside him in her servant's clothes, holding her head high despite the gasps and whispers that erupted like a storm. Greta Mondstein is my mate, Wolfgang declared. And she will be my queen. The reaction was mixed. Some of the older nobles recognized the Mondstein name and reacted with shock and outrage. Others, younger wolves who'd never known the pre-rebellion era, simply saw a servant being elevated to royalty and didn't know what to make of it. But Klaus Hoffmann, bless him, was the first to step forward and bow to Greta. My lady, he said formally. Welcome to the royal family. That broke the dam. Slowly, one by one, others followed Klaus's lead. Not everyone, not even most, but enough to send a clear message. The Alpha King had chosen, and those who valued their positions would adapt. The von Heller family left that very night, taking their supporters with them. Nearly a quarter of the court departed within 48 hours. But Wolfgang didn't waver. He held Greta's hand through every challenge, every threat, every moment of doubt. And when the time came to call the gathering of pack leaders, he stood before them all with the evidence of his father's crimes laid bare. The great hall had never held so many wolves. Every major pack leader in the kingdom had answered Wolfgang's summons, though many had come expecting a trap or a trick. They filled the massive space, hundreds of powerful wolves all watching Wolfgang with suspicion and curiosity, and in some cases, barely concealed hostility. Greta stood beside Wolfgang on the dais, wearing a dress that had belonged to his mother, a gesture that had not gone unnoticed. She was terrified, but she refused to show it. She'd been trained from birth to stand before crowds like this, even if she'd never expected to do it again. Wolfgang stepped forward, and the hall fell silent. "I have called you here to tell you the truth," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "A truth that has been buried for 30 years. A truth that my family committed terrible crimes to hide." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. 30 years ago, my father and several other pack leaders orchestrated a conspiracy. They staged attacks against their own people and blamed those attacks on the Mondstein pack. They manufactured evidence of corruption and tyranny. And when they had turned enough packs against the Mondsteins, they launched what we now call the Northern Rebellion. The murmurs grew louder, more agitated. "The rebellion was not a heroic uprising against a corrupt regime," Wolfgang continued, his voice steady despite the growing chaos. "It was a calculated power grab. Hundreds of innocent wolves died. Entire families were slaughtered. And the Mondstein line, one of the oldest and most honorable bloodlines in our kingdom, was nearly wiped out completely." "Lies!" someone shouted from the crowd. "The Mondsteins were tyrants." Were they? Wolfgang held up the journal. Or were they simply in the way? "I have here documented evidence of my father's conspiracy. Dates, names, financial records, witness testimony. All of it painstakingly gathered by Henrik Mondstein before he was murdered." He looked at Greta and she stepped forward. "My name is Greta Mondstein," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I am the last surviving heir of the Mondstein bloodline. My parents died protecting me when I was 15 years old. I have spent the last 3 years hiding in this very palace, working as a servant in the home that should have been mine." The crowd erupted. Some wolves surged forward in anger. Others called for silence. Several pack leaders were shouting questions all at once. The hall descended into chaos. Wolfgang raised his hand, and his alpha command rolled through the room like thunder. "Silence!" Every wolf in the hall felt it, that primal imperative to obey their king. The noise cut off instantly. "I know this is difficult to hear," Wolfgang said. "I know many of you fought in the rebellion. Many of you lost friends and family. Many of you have built your lives on the foundation of what we believed was a just cause. But the truth is the truth, whether we like it or not. What do you propose we do with this truth?" The question came from Lady Anneliese Bauer, one of the oldest and most respected pack leaders in the kingdom. "Should we tear down everything we've built? Go back to war?" "No." Wolfgang's voice was firm. "We acknowledge what happened. We make reparations to the families who were wronged. We build monuments to honor those who were unjustly killed. And we move forward together, committed to building a kingdom based on honesty and justice rather than lies and fear." "And what of you?" another voice called. "Should you remain as king, knowing your crown was bought with innocent blood?" Wolfgang took a deep breath. "That is for you to decide. I will not run from the consequences of my family's actions. If you believe I should step down, I will do so. If you believe I should face punishment for my father's crimes, I will accept that judgment. But I will not continue to lie. I will not continue to pretend that the foundation of our kingdom is anything other than what it is." The hall fell silent again, but this time it was a thoughtful silence. Greta watched the faces of the pack leaders, saw them processing, calculating, deciding. Finally, Klaus Hoffmann stepped forward. "I vote that Wolfgang Eisenkrone remain as our king," he said loudly. "He did not commit these crimes. He has shown more courage in revealing the truth than many of us would have. And he has proven that he values justice over power. That is the kind of leader we need." "I second that," said Lady Anneliese. "But I propose a condition. The Lady Greta Mondstein must be recognized as rightful heir to the Mondstein legacy. Their lands, their titles, their honors, all must be restored. And reparations must be paid," added another voice, "to all the families who suffered during the rebellion, from the royal treasury." "Agreed," Wolfgang said immediately. More voices joined in, some supporting, some dissenting, but gradually a consensus formed. The hall erupted in debate, and GRETA found herself surrounded by pack leaders asking questions, offering condolences, demanding details. It was overwhelming, terrifying, and oddly hopeful. 'Cause they were talking, not fighting, not killing each other in rage and grief. Talking. Maybe Wolfgang was right. Maybe their people were stronger than anyone had given them credit for. The final vote came just before dawn. Wolfgang would remain as king, but with conditions. The Mondstein name would be cleared and GRETA would be recognized as co-ruler, not just a queen consort, but an equal partner in leadership. Reparations would be paid. Monuments would be built. And a new council would be formed, with representatives from families who had been harmed during the rebellion, to ensure nothing like this could ever happen again. It wasn't perfect. There were still wolves who left the gathering in anger, still packs who withdrew their support entirely. The von Heller family was already gathering allies in the south, and everyone knew this wasn't over. But it was a start. 3 months later, on the first day of spring, GRETA Mondstein was crowned Queen of the Northern Territories in a ceremony that had been adapted to honor both the Eisenkrone and Mondstein traditions. She wore a dress of silver and white, with the Mondstein moon emblem embroidered in gold thread across her heart. Wolfgang stood beside her in his ceremonial armor, and when the crown was placed on her head, he knelt before her in front of the entire court. "I pledge my loyalty," he said, his voice carrying through the great hall, "to Queen GRETA Mondstein, rightful heir of the lunar bloodline, my mate, my partner, and my equal in all things." The symbolism was powerful and deliberate. The Alpha King, kneeling before a woman who had once scrubbed his floors, acknowledging her not just as his mate, but as his superior in bloodline and honor. Some of the older nobles wept. Others applauded. A few still looked scandalized. GRETA didn't care. She reached down and took Wolfgang's hand, pulling him to his feet. "Rise, my king," she said softly. "We rule together, or not at all." Wolfgang smiled and kissed her hand, and the crowd erupted in cheers. The celebration lasted 3 days. There was feasting and dancing and more political maneuvering than GRETA had thought possible. She met dozens of pack leaders, memorized hundreds of names, and tried desperately not to let the overwhelming responsibility of her new position crush her. But every time she felt herself faltering, Wolfgang was there, a steady presence at her side, his hand in hers, reminding her that she didn't have to do this alone. On the third night, when the last of the guests had finally stumbled off to bed and the palace was quiet, Wolfgang led GRETA out to the balcony of their shared chambers. The moon was full overhead, painting the Schwarzwald Mountains in silver light. Somewhere in the distance, wolves howled, a song of pack and family and home. "Do you ever regret it?" GRETA asked, leaning against Wolfgang's chest as his arms wrapped around her from behind. "Giving up the simple path. You could have married Christina, kept the peace, maintained the lies." "Not for a second," Wolfgang said immediately. "The simple path would have destroyed me slowly. At least this way, the hard path, I get to walk it with you." GRETA turned in his arms, looking up at the man who had become her everything. "I love you, Wolfgang Eisenkrone. Even when you're stubborn and impossible and too noble for your own good. I love you too, GRETA Mondstein." Wolfgang bent down, capturing her lips in a kiss that still made her knees weak. "My queen. My mate. My salvation." "So dramatic," GRETA teased against his lips. "You love it." "I really do." They stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, while the moon shone down and the kingdom slept peacefully around them. It wasn't perfect. There were still wolves who opposed them, still threats gathering in the shadows, still 1,000 challenges to face. The von Heller family was rumored to be forming an alliance with several border packs, and there were whispers of rebellion in the southern territories. But for tonight, in this moment, everything was exactly as it should be. 2 broken bloodlines healing together. 2 wounded souls, made whole by the mate bond that refused to be denied. 2 leaders who had chosen truth over convenience and love over power. And somewhere in the distance, Greta could have sworn she heard her mother's voice on the wind. "Well done, my brave girl. Well done." The North Tower Library had been rebuilt, better than before. Greta stood at the window, one hand resting on her rounded belly, and watched the sun set over the Schwarzwald Mountains. Inside her, twins tumbled and kicked, a boy and a girl, the healers had said. Heirs to both the Eisenkrone and Mondstein bloodlines, living symbols of unity and hope. "You're supposed to be resting," Wolfgang said from the doorway, though his tone was fond rather than stern. "I'm pregnant, not broken," Greta replied without turning around. "And besides, I wanted to see the new monument before the light faded completely." Wolfgang moved to stand beside her, and together they looked out at the massive structure that had been erected in the palace courtyard. It was made of white marble and black granite, carved with the names of every wolf who had died during the rebellion, both Mondstein loyalists and those who had truly believed they were fighting for justice. Above all the names, in letters that caught the light, was a single phrase: "May we never forget. May we always choose truth." "Do you think it's enough?" Greta asked quietly. "All the monuments, all the reparations, all the apologies. Do you think it's enough to heal what was broken?" Wolfgang considered the question seriously. "No," he finally said. "It's not enough. Nothing we do will ever truly be enough to make up for the lives that were lost, the families that were destroyed. But it's a start. And every day we choose to keep trying. That has to mean something." Greta leaned against him, and his arm came around her automatically. "The scouts reported that the von Heller alliance is growing. Klaus thinks they'll move against us within the year." "I know." Wolfgang's voice was calm, unbothered. "We'll be ready. You're not worried." "I'm terrified," Wolfgang admitted. "But I'm also hopeful. Because we've spent the last year building something real, Greta. Not just an alliance based on fear and lies, but a genuine coalition of packs who believe in what we're trying to do. We have support from families that would never have worked together before. We have wolves from both sides of the rebellion choosing to move forward instead of backward. We have each other," Greta added softly. "We have each other," Wolfgang agreed. He turned her to face him, his hands cupping her face with infinite gentleness. "And that makes us stronger than any army the von Hellers can raise." One of the twins kicked hard enough that Wolfgang felt it against his side. He laughed and dropped to his knees, pressing a kiss to Greta's belly. "Easy, little ones. You'll have plenty of time to fight when you're born." "They're going to be handfuls," Greta said, running her fingers through Wolfgang's hair. "Strong-willed and stubborn, just like their parents." "Horrifying," Wolfgang said cheerfully. "I can't wait." He stood and pulled Greta close, and they swayed together slowly, dancing to music only they could hear. Outside, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. The palace was settling into its evening routine. Somewhere in the kitchens, Margaret was probably organizing tomorrow's meals. Klaus would be making his final rounds of the guard posts. The kingdom was breathing, living, continuing. "Thank you," Wolfgang said suddenly. Greta looked up at him. "For what?" "For being brave enough to tell me the truth, even when it would have been easier to stay hidden. For choosing to fight instead of flee. For believing that I could be better than my father's legacy." Wolfgang's voice was thick with emotion. "For loving me when I didn't deserve it." "You've always deserved it," Greta corrected gently. "You just didn't know it yet." "I know it now." Wolfgang kissed her forehead, then her nose, then her lips. "Every single day, I wake up and thank the gods that you dropped that book. That you found that letter. That you were too stubborn to let me push you away." "The gods didn't have much to do with it," Greta said. "That was all mate bond." "Then thank the mate bond." "I do. Every day." They stood there as the darkness deepened, two silhouettes against the window, while the moon rose overhead and wolves began to howl their evening songs. This was their kingdom now. Built on truth and sacrifice and love that had refused to be denied. It wasn't perfect. It would never be perfect. There would always be threats, always be challenges, always be wolves who preferred the old ways of power and lies. But it was real, and it was worth fighting for. 5 years after that, a little girl with dark hair and gold eyes raced through the North Tower Library, her twin brother hot on her heels. "Careful," Greta called from her desk, where she was reviewing trade agreements with the Eastern Pax. "No running in the library." "Papa lets us run," the girl Elsa called back. "Papa is a terrible influence," Greta muttered, but she was smiling. The door burst open and Wolfgang entered, covered in mud and grinning like a fool. "Sorry we're late. We got distracted by a very serious battle with a mud puddle." "I can see that." Greta eyed his disheveled state with fond exasperation. "And who won this battle?" "The mud puddle," both children announced in unison, dissolving into giggles. Wolfgang crossed the library and kissed Greta soundly, not caring that he was getting mud on her dress. "How was your meeting with the Eastern representatives?" "Productive. They're willing to sign the new trade agreement, but they want assurances about border security." Greta wiped a smudge of mud off Wolfgang's cheek. "And you need a bath." "We all need baths," Wolfgang agreed cheerfully. "Come on, little wolves. Let's go terrorize the bath attendants." "Can we have bubbles?" asked the boy Felix. "Mountains of bubbles," Wolfgang promised. As they headed for the door, Elsa suddenly stopped and turned back. "Mama, is it true that you used to clean this library?" Greta smiled. "It is true. A long time ago, when I first came to the palace, this was my job." "But now you're the queen," Felix said, as if this were a very confusing concept. "Now I'm the queen," Greta confirmed. "Because sometimes the most important things happen when we least expect them. Sometimes the person scrubbing the floors is actually the person who will change everything." "I don't understand," Elsa said, frowning. "You will," Wolfgang said, scooping her up. "When you're older, we'll tell you the whole story. About how your mama was the bravest wolf in the entire kingdom, and how she saved all of us by refusing to hide who she really was." "Was there fighting?" Felix asked hopefully. "Some," Greta admitted. "But mostly there was truth. And love. And two people who chose each other even when the whole world said they shouldn't." "That's boring," Felix announced. Wolfgang and Greta looked at each other and burst out laughing. "Give it time," Wolfgang said. "One day you'll understand that the boring parts, the truth and the love and the choosing, those are actually the most exciting parts of all." As they left the library, Greta took one last look around the space where everything had changed, where she'd found the evidence that would destroy her world and rebuild it stronger, where she'd fallen in love with a man who should have been her enemy, where she'd finally stopped running and started fighting. The book was still there, on a special shelf. Henrik Mondstein's hollow tome with the letter that had started everything. Greta had preserved it carefully, a reminder of where they'd come from and why truth mattered. Someday, when Elsa and Felix were older, she would show them that letter. Tell them the full story of their grandfather's conspiracy and their grandmother's courage. Teach them that legacy was not something you inherited passively, but something you actively chose to honor or overcome. But for now, for today, she would simply enjoy this moment. This life she'd built with Wolfgang. This family that should never have existed but refused to be denied. Because in the end, that was what the mate bond really meant. Not just attraction or destiny or cosmic coincidence. Choice. The choice to see someone fully, all their flaws and scars and complicated history, and love them anyway. The choice to fight for something better, even when the easy path beckoned. The choice to believe that truth and love could actually change the world. Greta closed the library door behind her and went to join her family, her heart full and her conscience clear. They thought she was a servant. They thought she was nothing. But she was everything. And she had always known it. So that's the story of GRETA MONDSTEIN and Wolfgang Eisenkrone. The servant who was actually a queen. The king who chose truth over comfort. The love that refused to be denied by bloodlines or politics or 30 years of carefully constructed lies. Their story reminds us that our worth is not determined by how others see us, but by how we see ourselves. That truth, no matter how painful, is always better than the most comfortable lie. That love, real love, requires courage, sacrifice, and the willingness to fight for what's right even when it costs us everything. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of your own strength, your own worth, your own capacity for brave and transformative love, then please hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe, because there are so many more stories like this waiting to be told. Stories about hidden power and revealed truth. Stories about servants who were actually queens all along. Stories about love that changes kingdoms. And remember what I asked at the beginning. Tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? Whether it's Munich, London, Mumbai, Manila, New York, Berlin, or anywhere else in this beautiful world, I'm sending you a hug. Because we're all connected by stories like these. Stories that remind us who we really